All go.
Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for taking the time to be with us this morning. My name is ffinlo Costain. I'm the Chief Executive of Farmwell and founder of the Food and Global Security Network. Now, the Food and Global Security Network is interested primarily in two key things. The first is how we maintain a peaceful society in the face of ecological breakdown. And the second is, well, how do we mitigate the worst impacts of that ecological breakdown in the first place? And for us, food and food systems are at the center of that. How we produce food, how we transport and consume food, how we make meals. These are all critical to answering those key questions. And the Food and Global Security Network is a web of informed individuals, researchers, NGO leaders and campaigners from around the world, from the USA to New Zealand, through Australia, Africa, Europe, and of course, the United Kingdom. And the thing that binds us together is a passion for food systems, for nutritional security, because food security in and of itself isn't enough. We need good nutrient-dense food to be available affordably for all. And we cannot have food security if we don't have good functioning agricultural land. Now, many of you may well have taken part in webinars on this platform in the past. You may even have read our soil health, soil and security report, which is still available on our website, soilandsecurity.net. And you'll know that we review soil health as absolutely integral to these questions of the future. That soil health is the essential building block of biodiversity, because biodiversity cascades from below ground up through the food web. But of course, we can't have functioning soil without sunlight and without water. And it's water that we're here to talk about today. Water cycles and hydrological systems, about how it's critical to restore that hydrology if we are to rebalance the Earth's climate, to restore biodiversity and ensure that we have secure food systems for the future. And of course, water is truly amazing stuff. It's an alien substance that arrived here on Earth hundreds of millions of years after the Earth itself was formed, and which we and the food systems that we rely on just simply wouldn't exist without it. And so for billions of years, this substance has cycled and recycled through rocks and mountains, plants and animals, through oceans and ice caps, and of course, through the sky. And water and the way that hydrological function changes is also key to the story of climate change. Climate change isn't just about carbon, it's about hydrological function, as Walter will explain in just a moment. And of course, when we're thinking about the impacts of climate change, we're thinking about the impacts of water, storms, hurricanes, floods. These are the impacts of climate change, and they're part of the story of water. And the converse of that, the heat waves and the droughts that many of us have experienced across the last few months, the wildfires, they're part of the story of the absence of water. So water is at the center of the climate change story, and we need to better understand it if we're to mitigate and adapt to face the ecological crises that are now underway. Now, today, I'm really pleased to say that we're joined by two truly exceptional people. Walter Jehne is the world-renowned soil microbiologist and expert in hydrological systems. He's also the founder of Regenerate Earth, and I can just see the top of the Regenerate on your jumper there, Walter. So if you sort of sit up there, I've got Regenerate Earth logo on your chest. And Caroline Grindrod is a consultant and coach in regenerative agriculture, and was recently named Cumbria's Best Woman in Agriculture in 2022, which I'm sure she's very pleased that I've reminded everybody about. And her consultancy is called Roots of Nature. So welcome to both of you. As I say, welcome to everybody that's joining us today, and who will be joining us through the YouTube film and through the Farmgate broadcast of this webinar in the future. If you have questions as we're going through, please put them into the chat bar at the side and we'll pick up on them. Our intention is to have a discussion for about 40 minutes and then to spend the last 15 or 20 minutes of this session having questions from you in the audience. So without further ado, let me find my first question, which is for Walter. Now, Walter, you said that global warming and the prevention of climate extremes isn't just about carbon, but also hydrology. What do you mean?
Right. Well, thank you very much, Finlay, and thank you very much, everybody, for attending. And yeah, look, to explain the situation, we actually have two different issues here, haven't we? We've got the issue of global warming, and then we've got the issue of climate extremes. And in a sense, they epitomize the dilemma. There's no question that 60 years ago, Charles Keeling gave us the evidence that CO2 was going up abnormally. And basically, this was due to the oxidation, or had been due to the oxidation of carbon from our soils, from our landscape, burning well before our profligate use of fossil fuels. So yes, here is a symptom, a CO2 increase from oxidation of carbon. And yes, CO2 is a greenhouse gas. So yes, it has this global warming effect. No question at all about those facts, but we've got to make sure we don't confuse symptoms with causes, and certainly that we don't restrict our responses to just cleaning up symptoms, because the causes are much deeper. But the second part of your question gets more scary, actually, because it's prevention of climate extremes, dangerous hydrological climate extremes. And this was brought to the fore, the Hadley Center in 2005. Really, what are the dangerous hydrological extremes? And as you mentioned, they're the hurricanes, the floods, the droughts, the wildfires, the systemic aridification. And these are all hydrological, right? They're not basically CO2, they're hydrological. And hydrologically, impacts extremes kill people, destroy biosystem, and comes to your key issue, food security, because basically it's hydrology chiefly that governs whether we can grow food. There are 7 missed meals between social stability and chaos, basically, and it's that hydrology that governs whether there are those 7 meals available. So it's really quite fundamental. So water becomes much, much more critical. Okay, so we've got these two different concepts we've confused: global warming and dangerous hydrological extremes. One's long-term and one's, of course, short-terms and impacting at a society level. But they all basically link together, because basically the climate, 95% of the heat dynamics of the blue planet for the last 4 billion years has been driven by hydrological processes. 95% of that heat dynamics. The CO2 component of the greenhouse effect does about 4%. Okay, so we've got this sort of, the elephants not in the room, they're far too big. You know, it's hydrology. And really, we are now, after 60 years of talk, meetings, but no action, we're now at this point of dangerous hydrological extremes impacting, destroying biosystems, threatening communities. And we've really got to address the question, how do we actually manage this hydrology, but also how do we safely, naturally cool the climate? Because it's way too late, decades too late, to think that just emission reductions are going to sort of turn that 4% of the carbon, 4% of the greenhouse gas effect that is driven by CO2, that can actually safely cool the climate in time. So we both have hydrology is critical for essential food production, keeping biosystems alive, but it's also hydrology that's essential for cooling the planet safely and naturally. The good news is, yes, we can do it, but we've got to start debating and talking and acting on this new reality. But over to you.
It's not a conversation that seems to me to be particularly loudly had at global level. It's not something that is talked about a lot, in the same way that food systems aren't talked about a lot at things like, COP climate meetings. And I wonder, in your view, is it possible to solve global warming without a primary focus on hydrological cycles, and in particular, the restoration of the soil carbon sponge?
Okay, well, look, thank you. And that's really the critical thing. No, it is not possible to solve the climate crisis without hydrology. It's, as we said, 95% of the driver through various processes. So yes, that's where the agency is. And the other news is, yes, regenerating the Earth's soil carbon sponge is actually the thing that nature used to create the biosystem we evolved in and depend on. And it's our point of agency. We can do that as well as nature did. So the real simple take-home message is, yes, we can still influence the climate, but by restoring natural safe hydrological cooling, and we can do that by regenerating the Earth's soil carbon sponge, because it's that oxidation, degradation of the sponge, which has given the CO2 symptom, but has also completely compromised the hydrological capacity, buffering, and functioning of the ecosystem. Very
I'm
quickly
sure,
getting into...
Well, John, just to help, because I'm sure that many people listening will have heard of the concept of the soil carbon sponge, but I wonder if you could just, for those of us for whom the term is new, I wonder if you could just explain that term for us.
Okay, well, the sponge is simply a matter of basically, here are mineral detritus and organic detritus mixed up together through natural pedogenesis, soil forming processes. And by mixing these together, they create an open, loose matrix, three-dimensional matrix, which can infiltrate, retain, and make available water and nutrients. And that is enabled then plants to flourish across the whole 29% of the land surface of this planet. And of course, it's those plants, through their transpiration and their hydrological function, the air conditioners of this planet. Okay, so the sponge is really the change from mineral, hard, compacted mineral rock, impervious rock, to an open, loose, porous matrix, which gives you agency through its hydrological infiltration, retention, availability. Now, that agency comes, and it's, again, very simple. If we look at global warming, we've got a planet, we're getting 342 watts per square meter incident solar energy continually onto the surface of the troposphere. And basically, global warming, we're retaining an extra 3 watts per square meter abnormally. So it's less than 1% of the incident solar radiation. So we've got this challenge of how can we rebalance, recorrect a 1% extra heat retention by the planet, that solar radiation that isn't being readmitted. And so how do we manage the sponge, and how do we manage vegetation and the different hydrological processes we can go into to give us that 1% return of solar radiation back out to space to rebalance the heat dynamics of the planet? So when we look at it in that context, it's a 1% rebalancing, and it's totally doable safely, naturally, as nature did. But we've got to face that reality, look at those processes, because at the moment we're still in la-la land, dreaming just about carbon accounting rather than the actual functional role of carbon, the sponge, and hydrology in the planet's air conditioning.
And of course, thanks very much, Walter. And of course, just to put it in incredibly simple terms, when there isn't a functioning soil carbon sponge, when the land is compacted and essentially just goes back to rock, the water will just run off. But when there is a functioning soil carbon sponge, that water will be absorbed into the earth and held in the earth and released as nature requires it.
Absolutely.
Caroline, I'm just come to you in a second. I just wanted to, for those people who've come in new, I can see that there's a hand up. If you're able to pop questions into the chat box, that would be great. We're going to have a conversation for the next half an hour or so, and then or next 25 minutes, and then go over to questions from you, so that we're answering the things that you're particularly interested in, if they haven't already come up in the course of the session. So Caroline, can you sort of take us a bit further now in terms of our understanding of hydrological systems, our understanding of the soil carbon sponge, but what role now do regenerative farmers play in restoring that water cycling and restoring a functioning soil carbon sponge?
Thanks, Finlo, and thanks for inviting me and for everyone that's here. So yeah, it's great. So Walter, obviously, if anyone's heard him talk before, he talks about all these different sort of global climatic functions of the water cycle, which is incredible. As I say, rethinking the carbon thing and seeing how could these all these different effects, from clouds to transpiration to dampening the dust down, and then of course the carbon sponge, how does that how do we take that from a kind of macro climate function to what we can change on the ground? And that's kind of what I get more involved in. So perhaps the best way to approach this question is to go through the water cycle as we teach it to regenerative farmers, so you can see the kind of the small water cycle and how we can genuinely impact that on the ground, because ultimately this disruption, this climate derangement is what's going to stop food being produced, isn't it? So, and we can buffer that hugely within our farming practices on a farm by farm basis. So what we're really trying to do in regenerative agriculture is we're trying to create whole system ecological function for the continuous primary production. So essentially we're trying to grow more green plants for the benefit of cooling the planet, for the benefit of the wildlife, and for the benefit of the farm that can then make a profit from either grazing animals or eating directly those green plants. So really what we need to think about is how do we slow the flow of rainfall to make it effective, so that we are capturing every bit that falls onto the surface, retaining it for as long as possible, recharging our rivers and our aquifers, and then making sure that that's leading through a plant that's made use of it, essentially. And then it can be transpired back out into the atmosphere to be made use of by these climate functions. So in a practical sense, what we can do as farmers on the ground is we can look at every part of that raindrop's journey. So the first most important thing is, does that raindrop fall directly onto bare soil? Because if it falls onto bare soil, really what happens is, it's a little bit like, I liken it to tamping concrete. You get all the findings come to the surface and it creates an impervious kind of layer. And in our part of the world, in the UK, where it's moist, that tends to make a stop airflow, and we get that slimy surface. But then when it gets hot, and in the dry lands of the world, that creates a really hard cap. And then what happens, of course, is that when it does rain, the water runs straight off the surface and over the surface, instead of going into the soil structure. So that's really important. First step is we need vegetated soil. So we need the raindrop to hit either a tree or a tall plant, and not directly onto the soil. And the whole process of it hitting a tall plant, whether that be a tall grass plant or a hedge, is that can break the impact, and it can trickle and slow that process of the water going into the soil profile. So anything that's growing tall as well has deep roots. So the idea is that we slow the raindrop, and then we help it through capillary action sort of go into the soil profile rather than across the surface. So that's the first part. We can manage our grazing, we can manage our systems, that we never leave the soil bare. And then you've got to think, right, well, then you get down to the soil surface level. So in an ideal world, we want some sort of protection on the soil surface, so that we can, once we've got the water into the soil, we keep it in the soil. And ideally a kind of decaying mulch on the soil surface, which is fabulous because it feeds worms and all the biology that's going to be making holes and little crevices in the soil to let the water infiltrate and penetrate. But also it stops the evaporation. So that literally keeps a soggy sponge on the surface and prevents all the water that has fallen onto the surface from just simply evaporating out, which it does on bare soil. And then it stops the wind and on all of that process sort of drying that up. So we're making effective use of any water that comes onto our soil. So, and then we want to make sure that we've got lots of diversity as well. So each plant, we want tall plants, but we also want lots of different species of plant, because each different species has what we call different root architecture. Each plant, some will have fibrous roots, some will have tall, the long tap roots, and that means that the water is being kind of put into different layers in the soil right down to the depths. And diversity is also really important because it helps to create soil aggregation. So basically having lots of species working together, all exuding different cocktails of root exudates, helps to form these little balls of soil that are bound up by glues, biological glues, and they are like hollow balls of soil that then help to retain the water, and it also helps the water go into deeper layers. So if we do all of those things, then we, with diverse pastures and or woodlands or whatever we're working with, then we should get the development of mycorrhizal fungi and networks as well. And that's sort of like you then get really big aggregates all pulling together. And then you also get plants that can connect up with these super roots, these mycorrhizal fungi that allows the penetration of the water into those layers, but also the plants can then get into the tiny little crevices and explore the soil that we wouldn't normally be able to access the water from under normal circumstances. So in a nutshell, in our regenerative system, what we're looking for is not disturbing the soil, making sure we're keeping a habitat of microorganisms that can do all of that stuff and bind up the soil aggregates, protect the soil surface by trampling and allowing plants to grow tall, ensuring our swards are diverse through proper management, rest and recovery, and that sort of thing.
So thanks so much, Caroline, for that overview. And I guess the next question, and especially when we're talking about climate change and the way in which so many people have a bad view of the role of ruminants, how integral are ruminants to this process and these processes that you've been talking about?
So when we're talking about grasslands in particular, and for Walter and mentioned the figures on desertification, it's a huge vast area, and a lot of our land base is grassland by naturally, and herbivores, grasslands co-evolved with herbivores. So the process, particularly in the dry lands, is absolutely key. Having herbivores and ruminants in that system. So how it would originally have worked is that those animals in very large numbers would be predated by their pack hunting predators. That would mean that they would be bunching and moving together. And in the dry lands where you've got seasonal rainfall, you end up with a big flush of vegetation growing in the when there's moisture around that gets very tall. And then because in the dry season there isn't that, like here we can just decay and digest plant material all year round, but in the dry lands that doesn't happen because it's just too hot and too dry. So that natural decay process doesn't happen on its own. And then what tends to happen is that it bakes the soil surface. The soil surface becomes open and bare because the minerals are essentially locked up in that tall vegetation. And then because the soil is getting very hot in the sun, up to, I'm not sure what temperatures Walter could tell us perhaps, but, very high temperatures where, at 60 degrees microbes die essentially. So the digestion process from those microbes in the soil isn't available. So animals in that bunching and moving kind of mob would go through, knock that vegetation to the floor, eat it, because essentially their gut is full of those microbes that can digest that plant material. They would dung it and urinate it onto the grass. And because they're in a big mob, they would then have to leave that area and not come back for some time. And that process is allowing the mineral cycle to continue through the dry season. And then when it does rain, instead of the rain falling onto hard-capped soil and then rushing straight off the surface into the rivers, flooding everything, and then we've lost that rainfall for that whole season, then the sort of decaying mulch on the surface from that trampling and manure will allow that to be soaked up and then sort of perpetuate growth through the next season. So in the drylands, incredibly important that we've got at least something mimicking that process. So if we haven't got the wild herbivores in that system, we need to mob animals together in a management system to mimic that. And of course, as soon as you start to fence animals in and take away their predators, they no longer have to do that bunching, trampling process. Therefore, they can just choose what they want to eat. They can nibble down the roots, which means nibble down the plants, which means the roots get short. That doesn't allow the water to go in, and the whole thing starts to desertify, and that process begins. So dry land's incredibly important, but even in moist areas of what we call non-brittle and holistic management in the UK, what you're seeing is, particularly on the uplands and a lot of the east of the country now, is starting to see these processes happen. You've got set stocking of animals that are selectively grazing the whole year round. It takes away the litter, it keeps the plants short, and you're seeing this even on the and again in the uplands where you've got a lot of the fertility washed out of the system through high rainfall, and then you've got very acidic soils, you're actually getting a very brittle type environment where things go rank, and you've got the same sort of processes. So yeah, very important to have herbivores as part of that system.
Thanks so much, Caroline. Just before we go on, I apologise that clearly I've not set up the chat settings appropriately. I always feel that there's going to be something that goes wrong on a Zoom webinar. It's clearly this. So if you do have questions that you'd like to submit, then maybe if you could raise your hand, then I'll know that there are questions pending. And you can also, if you don't want to speak to everybody when we get to the questions, just send me an email at ffinlo@ffinlo.org. I've put my email address in the chat function that I can use, but sadly you can't. So do send those emails along. And Walter, coming back to you, perhaps you could pick up on the issue around temperatures on arid land versus grassland in your answer. But clearly, when we're thinking about the role of ruminants in drawing carbon out of the air and managing hydrology, we can see that that's hugely important. But I wonder whether regenerative livestock management is actually able to not only slow global warming and sequester carbon, but physically cool the planet as well.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Very important. And to picking up from what Caroline said, yeah, we've got about 6 billion hectares, or 40% of the land surface made up with grassland. If it wasn't for herbivores, then those grasslands would just grow up rank, dry, burn, and return to desert. Okay, so this is fundamental. The herbivores are essential symbionts for those grasslands, evolved together fairly recently, 100 million years, and really essential for those biosystems. And as Caroline has explained, that grass growth then allows that system to infiltrate water into the sponge and, of course, give that hydrological cycle. You don't have that in a mineral desert. And it's that that hydrological cycle that, of course, gives us our cooling potential. I mean, we won't go into it in all detail, but basically there's 5 key hydrological processes that grassland vegetation foster, which wouldn't happen if it was a desert. I mean, the first one is just simply evapotranspiration, latent heat going from the surface back up into the atmosphere and out to space, with water basically turning from a liquid into a gas. And that takes about 24% of the incident solar radiation from the surface back into the atmosphere and space, cooling that surface. Okay, wouldn't happen unless you had hydrology. The same thing happens at hydrology, what's in the air. It'll then nucleate to form clouds. Those clouds reflect incident solar radiation directly back out to space. And again, that does about 33% of the planet's natural cooling. So increase clouds, you can increase natural cooling. Also, of course, when those clouds condense, they return the rain to the soil, but remove the water vapor from the air. The water vapor is actually the dominant greenhouse gas. 80% of the greenhouse gas effect is water vapor. And that reopens in nighttime radiation windows that allows heat to escape at night from where otherwise it'd be trapped by that water vapor. And that does about 20% of the cooling. But just very briefly, the most important and interesting and powerful point of agent we have is if we have grassland, which is green, protected, and shaded, then the soil under those grasslands, even in tropical areas, rarely gets above 20 degrees centigrade. By contrast, an open, bare, exposed soil, desert landscape can easily get to 70 degrees plus surface temperature. And it's a simple rule of physics, inescapable on anywhere in the universe, that the amount of re-radiation from a substance is the 4th power of its temperature in degrees Kelvin. Simple physics, right? Which means that it's temperature times temperature times temperature times temperature. So a hot, dry desert at 70 degrees centigrade re-radiates massively more heat than a cool, protected, moist grassland at 20 degrees centigrade. Now, the punchline is simply this: the greenhouse effect is governed by the amount of re-radiation, factor 1, times the percentage of that re-radiation, which is then absorbed by greenhouse gases, of which CO2 is 11%, water vapor is 80%, methane and other gases 9%. Okay, so the greenhouse effect is governed by the amount of re-radiation times the percentage absorbed by gases. But by keeping land surfaces grazed, cool, protected, we can turn down the amount of re-radiation through this simple Stefan-Boltzmann physics, the re-radiation physics. We can in fact turn down the greenhouse effect radically, instantaneously, even if we haven't changed the greenhouse gases in the air, because greenhouse gases can't absorb heat that hasn't been re-radiated, logically. Okay, and so we've got, in a sense, the stove. We can turn the stove from ultra high to simmer by just keeping landscapes cool, moist, and protected. And nature does that through grasslands, grazing ecologies over 6 billion hectares of this planet. And therefore, us regenerating those ecological grazing systems to maintain the sponge, to maintain hydrology, to maintain grasslands, are critically powerful in giving us a cooling agency on this planet. The beautiful thing is we can do this over vast areas, and we can do this within weeks, not the centuries or millennia it'll take to drop CO2 levels. We can do it in weeks simply by not mowing our lawns effectively, simply by giving protective soil cover through ecological grassland management. So it's our most powerful agency. And as I said before, we've got 5 billion hectares of man-made desert and wasteland on this planet that was all vegetated 8,000 years ago. The Sahara, Australia, you name it, it was all Middle East, it was all vegetated. And if we can restore even 20% of that back to protective, cooler surfaces, we can turn down the greenhouse effect naturally, safely, in time. We can cool this planet.
So it's not just about managing the grasslands that we currently have, but reversing aridification across, huge portions of the land. And I'm interested when you mention places like the Sahara, the idea that we can actually reverse, desertification there through the imposition of livestock and the restoring of ecological cycles.
And yeah, look, it's all there in our face. If we read history, the Romans got all their wild animals from the Colosseum from Libya. If you go to Libya now, what have we got? Desert. Obviously, 2,000 years ago, it was the savanna grassland, because they wouldn't have been able to get the lions, the tigers, etc. Not tigers, the lions and the wild animals for the Colosseum. So in 2,000 years, we've desertified Libya. And basically, we have the capacity through grassland management, ruminant management, to regenerate that, but in that process, naturally, safely cooling the planet in time.
I wonder if you could just spend a minute or two, talking about, because your work isn't just theoretical, is it? You're actually involved in the practical application of this, particularly in India at the moment. And I wonder if you could just talk through, what you're doing in India and what you're finding there.
Well, look, exactly that. I mean, because we're running out of time. We have 10 years or less to make the effective change. We need to make change at scale, practically grassroots on the ground. In India, it's basically now switched the whole nation, but starting from Andhra Pradesh, natural farming, zero budget natural farming strategies, thousands, well, actually millions of farmers going into natural farming. And basically, instead of having one crop and then having green cover for a third of the time and 2/3 of the time that soil was red, dry, baking, natural farming is able to extend green cover 365 days of the year. And so it's giving you now 3 crops, higher yield, higher water retention, but also having an enormous effect in dropping that hot re-radiated surface 66% of the time. So it's a matter of, yeah, like the area times the time. And basically it's as simple as, yeah, changing a cropping system, changing a grazing system. We can re-green degraded land through right agroecology practices within a matter of months. And if we can do that at scale, as we're doing in India, then we can turn what was otherwise, in India's term, 70% red, 30% green, we can make it 90% green and fundamentally change it. We've got over 1 million women farmers in Andhra Pradesh doing this natural farming and benefiting enormously, socially, ecologically, economically from that natural farming change.
Yeah,
and of course, the potential is extending that globally, Africa, Asia, everywhere.
It's fascinating, and it's really exciting to hear about the work that you're doing there. And of course, that chimes with people, who are familiar with the work of Alan Savory and the Savory Institute. Now, Caroline, coming back to you, regenerative agriculture requires a very different approach. The type of farming, that we're talking about, where livestock are integrated, where there are rotations, sort of put back in place. And of course, regen prioritizes biological function and values the complexity in systems. And I wonder how farmers and others working in food systems can begin to adopt this mindset, which for many will be very, very different to the approach that they've been taught in agricultural college, or just, growing up on a farm, because it's very different to perhaps what their parents and grandparents have done.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, you can just copy some of the techniques and the practices, and that'll get you so far. But if we really, really want to benefit from the kind of whole system function that we're talking about here, we need to start to learn how to think like an ecosystem. And in holistic management, we think of that as holistic thinking, but you could call it systems thinking. It's that non-linear thinking where 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2. And we have to understand how to work with that, because living systems are complex and not complicated. So once you take a piece out, once a species goes missing, it changes and accommodates, and it's changed forever. So we need a whole different way of understanding how to work with those systems, because ultimately what we're trying to do is mimic those ecological processes and that system, because those are the most resilient systems in the world. They are growing the most primary production from rainfall and sunshine. So as a farming system, that's a pretty good way to go, isn't it? So what we've got to try and do is understand how to benefit from that whole system function, instead of simplifying it, reducing it, separating it, studying it, and then just thinking that we can adopt the practices. So what we tend to do is we try and teach that way of thinking, which usually involves a couple of days of intensive training, using lots of different examples to illustrate that. So one way of sort of trying to illustrate why 1 + 1 might equal 4 in the case of a healthy ecosystem is examples like, there's a lovely story I've heard, I can't remember where it came from now, but where basically a vineyard was taking that linear thought process that those plants around the bottom of the vines are going to be sucking up water, therefore we must kill those to allow more water to be given to the vines. Whereas in actual fact, when they undersowed it with a diverse sward of flowers and herbs, actually they ended up reducing their water usage by about 40% or something. There's lots of different versions of that same story. It doesn't make any linear sense that more plants sucking up water would lead to less water use. But in actual fact, what's happening in the soil is that, across the whole surface, is that the transpiration is cooling it, so you get less evaporation. The water is being able to be penetrated into the soil surface. The aggregates have developed so that they're holding onto the water, not evaporating. The mycorrhizal fungi is allowing the plants to explore more of the water, including the vines, because they're talking to each other. The whole system is starting to need less water and be more resilient. So that's one way of sort of thinking about how this non-linear way of working comes about. So we kind of call this redefining productivity. And if you think of like a dairy system, you might, if you're thinking purely about productivity through the lens of how much grass can I grow in every grazing, then you might think of, okay, well, let's go for ryegrass and clover in a lab or in a field trial. That clearly is the most productive, but then you've got to reseed it so many, every few years. and you've got a lot of bare soil because it's got a very low carbon to nitrogen ratio. So it's hard to keep a mulch on the soil surface. It's quite gappy, which means you've got bare soil that's evaporating. So if every other year you're going into drought and losing productivity through the main part of the season, then over a 10-year period, is it really that productive? Because ultimately we've collapsed our soil from the use of nitrogen. That whole system is designed around the starting point of the plant. We've bred for plants that don't give exudates and talk to the soil microbes because that's inefficient. Therefore, that plant grows really well in the presence of nitrogen, but not so well under no fertility circumstances. That we've bred cows that then do well on that type of plant. They're very digestible plants and lots of protein and energy. And then ultimately our whole infrastructure, staffing, contracts that we take up with our milk companies and everything is designed for that system. So we can't just change one little piece of that. We can't just do a paddock grazing trial and assume that we're going to see the result being great. That's just going to fail. We need the whole system to adapt and change. So that's what I mean when I talk about whole system functioning. So the farmers need to understand that, but also the scientists, people like Walter, are brilliant because they truly understand this whole system function, whereas a lot of reductionist science is missing that, leading us to sort of chasing net zero as a kind of, the main thing that we're doing at the moment. And then the policymakers and the companies setting up the contracts, everybody needs to understand that better.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. We're gonna. It's about 11:15 now, and we're gonna run over for 5 or 10 minutes because there are some questions coming in here, and we started a little bit late, so we will be finished, shortly after 11. But we will run over very slightly. There's one final question that I have that I want to put to you, Walter, if that's okay, before we go into the audience questions, which there's some really interesting stuff coming through, and the question is about ruminants. And of course, ruminant producers have been heavily criticised because cattle, sheep and goats produce methane. And so what I want to ask you is about how important ruminant methane is in the big scheme of things, so far as you're concerned.
Okay, well, look, it's very much what Caroline was saying. Instead of having a linear system, a reductionist look and say, hey, yes, cattle, well, all herbivores, all anaerobic digesters produce methane, us included. Instead of saying here's a bad thing, methane, we've got to look at it as a cycle. We've got to look at, okay, what happens in nature? And if we do that with methane, it's just very, very simple, absolute, because methane naturally for the last 100 million years has been at a very, very low 700 parts per billion or thereabouts. And we've had more cattle and we've had more herbivores and more wetlands producing methane. So yes, we've been producing quite vast quantities of methane naturally, but also nature has got a way of removing methane. Otherwise, it couldn't have been 700 parts per billion. And of course, that process is very simple. We've known about in science, totally verified, but we're ignoring it in the political debate totally. And of course, that's a hydroxyl ion formation when water vapor transpired largely from pastures is then photooxidized by sunlight and forms hydroxyl ions and then hydrogen, which forms bicarbonate ions, complex process. But basically producing hydroxyl ions, which is effectively the laundry of the atmosphere. And it's that hydroxyl ion production which cleans up the air, removes particulate carbon, CO2, carbon monoxide, keeps the air clean. Now, a very simple thing. A cow, for example, grazing a pasture will sustain about 5 acres, 2 hectares of pastures, depending on the grassland. That cow will produce 100 times or more the hydroxyl ion methane cleanup capacity compared to its own methane emissions. So this little cow, we should be not calling it Patsy, we should be calling it back to being Daisy, i.e. it's an ecosystem service that's enormously benefiting the planet, removing methane naturally. So instead of making her Patsy and sort of trying to tax the methane emissions from her, we should be crediting the ecosystem services, the photooxidation value of that cow. This becomes extremely important, an existential importance, right? Because we've got some 15,000 billion tons of carbon as methane hydrates and in tundras sitting in the Arctic regions of this planet. And if that releases in a pulse, and it is slowly releasing, hopefully not as a pulse, then that can become an extinction event, that vast flux of methane. The only thing that is actually stopping that danger, and the only thing that can avoid that, is enough hydroxyl ion formation from healthy grasslands maintained by healthy herbivores, which are producing some methane, 1 in 100. Okay, so we've got this stupid bullshit, excuse the pun, basically, you know, that where we're trying to penalize herbivores because they're producing methane, ignoring the 100-fold benefit that they are generating and cleaning up not just methane, but CO2 and carbon monoxide, carbon particulate, polyaromatic carbons from the atmosphere. So we've just got to get real and look at it a whole, as Caroline says, a whole systemic analysis rather than taking a reductionist single linear factor and going la on that.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Walter. That was actually sort of addressing a question that came in prior to the webinar from Bill. So thanks very much for that, Bill, and making sure that we covered that particular issue. Jim, you've asked a question about sharing and linking to this webinar when it's available on YouTube. Please do. The more shares, you know, this webinar gets, the more the messages, you know, that are contained within it can be shared around the people who need to hear them. We've got a question here from Catherine, and please, people, if you would like to ask a question at this point, do put up your hand or do send a question by email to me. Catherine asks, in the UK, we are in fact predominantly a wooded biome. We're not one of the great natural grasslands. So for the water cycle and the carbon sponge, is it not better to majorly reforest, natively reforest our land in association with pasture and crops if necessary? Who wants to start with that?
Well, look, very, very quickly, I'll let Caroline do the most of it, but the point is that no, it doesn't matter if it's grassland or forest, it doesn't matter if it's a cow or if it's an insect or a bird, it's the same process. Nature's got diversity, it'll use trees, it'll use grasslands, it'll use wetlands. It's all the same function of basically soils, retaining water, making nutrients available, growing plants, transpiring, and herbivores managing that biosystem. But no, there's no favoritism here, grassland versus forest. It's horses for courses, it's diversity, it's plurality, it's synergies.
And I would say as well, just before passing over to Caroline, that my understanding, you know, historically from, you know, talking to people who understand the way that Britain has evolved, is that this idea that it was mainly covered in native woodland is not quite right, that there was obviously a lot more woodland than there is today, but it was actually also a lot more grassland, a lot more savanna type land as well, which was lots of scrub and bushes and grasses, as well as that sort of more heavily densely wooded areas. Caroline.
Yeah, completely agree with both of you. And what I would say is, yeah, absolutely, we want diverse range of habitats, but originally it probably would have been that, yeah, we wouldn't have had the big plain type habitats with huge, you know, mobs of animals together, but we would have definitely had herbivores in our woodlands. So it would have probably been more like a savanna, as you say, with open glades and woodland. And that's very much what we try and encourage farmers to manage, that type of, you know, that type of wood pasture, again, for all the amazing benefits of, you know, reducing evaporation and reducing, you know, improving the infiltration and all of that. But ultimately, we do still, even in the woodlands, we do still need to have those things that are digesting that plant material and improving the cycling of the nutrients. And then in the uplands, where a lot of, you know, the UK has got a great deal of steep ground that's not suitable for any other food production. In those areas where you've got a high rainfall and steep sides, what's happened over time is you've ended up what would have been a wooded environment or a savanna type environment, probably quite high up the sides, is that the soil has washed out, the fertility is washed out through probably a combination of deforestation and reduce, killing predators and various other things. And now we've got a denuded landscape that doesn't, we've got some areas that tend to bog, and that's slowing the flow to some degree, but we haven't, that landscape goes rank, and it would benefit from properly managed herbivores. I'm not talking about the set stocking that we currently have, but if properly managed herbivores in that system would increase and improve the water retention, and in there too, something like 2 buckets of water per every % of carbon increasing in the soil that we can hold extra up the hill, rather than it flooding down into the bottoms with all the nutrients attached and ending up in our homes.
And actually, am I right, Caroline, that when we're talking about, those upland areas, perhaps, particularly the lower uplands, that actually the ruminants are part of that process, but the reintegration of bush and shrub and sort of low-level trees, sort of more agroforestry systems, are actually really important in terms of maintaining and restoring that cycling of nutrients and water.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, there's another question that I'm going to go to in just a second, but it relates to a question that I've put recently, a podcast that we put out just this morning on the Farmgate channel, which is called Regeneration, Not Regenesis, where I'm talking to Jehne Fernandez about why she was upset when she read George Monbiot's book Regenesis, and why she thinks that although many of the issues that he identifies are really important, that his sort of anti-farming solutions are not the solutions that we need. And so it goes to this question again, this idea that we can move forwards, we can solve the problems that we face without default livestock systems, without livestock being integrated in there. So the question from Dorrit is regeneration without large herbivores possible, as the vegan community is telling the public? She says that she can't see how, but we could do with some solid science to back us up when we let the cows out and stand in for the missing wildlife as habitat engineers. So Walter, perhaps we can come to you first.
Yeah, well, look, very much, and I don't have the UK specifics in this, but look, it's very, very clear. We need the herbivores as biorecyclers, right? It's absolutely critical, because if we just let wilderness happen and we'll just get scrub, we'll get fire fuels, we'll get wildfires, we'll get carbon oxidation, desertification, and we turn back to desert wasteland, right? So the whole point of herbivores was to avoid those catastrophic events and that degradation, because it's the herbivores that are taking that excess biomass, often old biomass, and turning it back into biofertilizer through their dung and also soil carbon. So it's this biological cycling function of the herbivores that is critical. We obviously don't just have to look at cattle here. I mean, termites are herbivores. Insects in the canopies are herbivores. The biomass of these herbivores are vastly higher than just the cattle that we see as, daisies or herbivores. So yes, this biocycling is absolutely critical, because if not, we end up with the default wildfires, and then we end up with desertification.
Caroline, I wonder if you could address that as well. I mean, I don't want to sit here and judge people for their choices, on the food that they choose to eat. The world has got plenty of space for vegans and vegetarians, the same as it has meat eaters. But I guess the core of the question is, if everybody was a vegan, would we be able to do what we need to do? How critical are livestock to the processes that we're talking about?
So I think in the non-brittle environments of Europe and the UK, you could probably, on a very small scale particularly, you could use compost as a proxy for grazing animals. There's a way of sort of micromanaging that process with our tools, physically knocking vegetation down, strimming it, using compost, that sort of thing. It could be done. And on a small scale, if people choose to do that as part of their belief system, that's totally fine. But ultimately, you've got to realize that we're not really separating that out. It's not like there's no living things in that system. Ultimately, compost is made up of just very small animals instead of big animals. So it's all death and decay and eating each other. So we're under a little bit of an illusion if we think we can actually have a truly vegan vegetable. Ultimately, that if it's being fed naturally through those composted systems, then it's eating dead decaying material. It's just that it's a slightly different size, doesn't have a, you know, a character perhaps. So, you know, really it's just, for me, there is no way of segregating that. So yes, it could be done, particularly in the moister areas of the world. But then when you start to get into those macro landscapes of the uplands of the UK, even where we're talking about thousands of acres of, you know, very low grade grassland in steep areas that are rocky, that can't produce food in any other way, like what would, you know, okay. And again, I would totally dispute the argument that removing the animals is better for the ecology. It's not, in my experience, it's not actually. And actually that whole process of cycling the nutrients is regenerating the energy system, which means that we've got more photosynthesis and primary production, which means leads to more wildlife. You know, I see that as a plus plus. But ultimately we can maintain that kind of healthy hydrology and mineral cycling, and it'd be very difficult to do that in any other way. You know, planting trees, yes, but then, you know, trees alone without a herbivore trampling and manuring and improving that soil fertility are not going to do as well as you know, a whole system that includes the right type of browsing and grazing animals. And as Walter says, that's tiny, you know, birds, herbivory, right through to insects, right through to organisms in the soil, right through to the animals that would, you know, the deer, the, you know, what the proxies for what would have been wild at the time. So I just think that, you know, we've got a solar power, I love Walter's way of describing these solar powered, you know, self-replicating biodigesters that we can eat and taste great and are really nutritious, that can go up and, if we're properly managing them, can do great, you know, great stuff on these upland large environments and these desert regions of grassland that we're talking about. Why wouldn't we do that, you know, for me?
And of course, you know, the thing that we haven't touched on is the economics of this as well. And when we're talking about managing landscape, this needs to be paid for, you know, in one way or another. And the best way is to integrate these this functioning of nature, this managing of that landscape, so that it cycles water and sunlight and nutrients in the way that it needs to, is to have an active farming community, so that farmers are able to earn money for the food that they're producing, as well as managing the landscape that they do. I've got one final question that I want to put to you both, if I may, just briefly, and it's that, you know, I've said in the past that you can win a war with guns and tanks, perhaps, but a functioning food system is essential to maintaining the peace once you've won that war, and it's essential to maintaining peace so that you avoid that war in the first place. Now, just in your own view, briefly, how critical is soil and hydrological function to maintaining peace? Caroline, can I come to you first? And then I'll give Walter the last word.
I guess it's more obvious how important that is in the drylands, and Walter could speak to that. But even in the UK, you know, you can just start to think about, I suppose, some of what's happening at the moment has made me think a lot about what would happen if, you know, if we suddenly got cut off from fertilizer, if the grain stopped being available, all of those things, the what ifs that we do think about in regenerative. And you know, as Walter says, we're sort of 7 meals away from anarchy, even in what we've considered to be a country that could never happen. How important now do we realize that having our own, you know, energy resilience and food resilience and food production resilience, and it's got to be so much more than just calories or protein. We've got to think of truly sustainable, nutrient dense foods available throughout the season, in ways that can be stored and utilized effectively. So just relying on calories from cropping systems that might be highly productive on a, you know, comparing it with another system, but then it might be subject to drought and fail, and or it doesn't work if we can't get a part for our combine or whatever else, is a very vulnerable situation to be in. So for me, you know, if the food system breaks down, it's not going to take long for people to start to break down too, society to start to break down. So for me, it's really made, if it wasn't already obvious to me, this year has really highlighted the importance of this on a farm by farm basis. We need resilient food systems for our local communities.
Thank you, Caroline. Walter, you get the last word.
Well, look, yeah, I fully agree. I mean, that point, 7 missed meals between social stability and chaos. And therefore, it's really imperative, isn't it, that we've got to look at resilience, we've got to look at autonomy, we've got to look at localized cycles, and all of that is building around soil health. It's really the soil that gives us resilience, autonomy, cycling. It's optimizing those cycles, but it's also empowering societies, because that's where your employment, it's your eco-enterprises. You know, this is how you build resilient, healthy, diverse societies as well. And really, yeah, I think the building the soil, the sponge, the hydrology, those food systems is critical. But of course, don't leave it to me. That's what Jared Diamond did the thing. He said, look, here's civilizations. Over 20 civilizations across the history have collapsed. We see them in the dust of archaeology because they've destroyed their soils. And the only civilizations that have survived are civilizations that have sustained, regenerate, and enhanced their soils. President Roosevelt made the statement, a nation that destroys its soil destroys itself. And we're very close to that imperative, but we're not going to escape history if we don't actually take heed of those warnings.
And I think those messages are relevant and critical throughout the world, whether we're in a very dry climate or whether we're in, you know, a much more temperate climate like the UK, because soil degradation is happening everywhere. And, you know, we're just at different stages of this process. And as the planet continues to warm, we may find ourselves further along those routes than we expect to be in the future. Thank you very much to both of you on the panel. Thanks very much to the audience for the questions and for being here and taking part. I mean, what a fantastic opportunity it's been to listen to, you know, the wisdom of both Walter and Caroline, and to hear that conversation. This conversation will be available on YouTube later today, and then next week it'll be released on the Farmgate channel as a podcast. And I would urge you to share the conversation in whatever way you share it with your colleagues and with friends, because I think it's a really important conversation that we've been part of this morning. So that's it. Thank you very much indeed, everybody, for joining us. Thank you to Walter Jehne from Regenerate Earth and Caroline Grindrod from Roots of Nature, and hopefully we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks,
Okay, thank you very much. All the very best.
Phil.
All the best.